Jesus Christ comes back, there's going to be happening on earth a time of trouble such as never was. That's what the Bible says. So it's a really good idea for us to get our heads around what this time of trouble such as never was is going to be like. So there's three bits to what we're going to look at this evening. The first bit is, what is it actually going to be like? And we're going to have a look at some video, right, as to somebody who's put together in graphics what it might actually look like. And I've got to tell you, it's pretty scary stuff. But all of it is taken straight out of the Bible. The second thing that we're going to do is say, well, okay, God says, I'm going to bring a time of trouble on the earth. The big question I think we need to answer is, especially when we've seen how bad it is why? Why is God going to bring such cataclysmic trouble to this earth? And you're going to help me work that one out. So that's that bit. And the third bit is, and probably the most important of the lot is, well look, yes, all this is going to happen. Yes, God has said why it's going to happen, and we now understand that. But where is the hope in all of this? Because you could watch this and literally think there is no hope. So at the very end of it, we're going to look and see what the hope is. So first question is, somebody tell me, where is that taken from? This is a phrase in your Bible, in your authorized version. This is word for word. A time of trouble such as never was. Which book in the Bible do I need to go to read that? We'll start with the book to start with, and then we'll get to the chapter. So which book?
Luke.
Not Luke, no.
Daniel.
So, okay, so Daniel is the right answer. Now, which do you think is the chapter that we would need to go to? And you've got a 1 in 12 chance, right, of getting this one right. So which chapter do you reckon? 11 is the wrong answer. But you're pretty close. 12 is the right answer. So, come and have a quick look at Daniel chapter 12. Daniel chapter 12 verse 1, it says, there shall be a time of trouble such as never was. You see that there? And it then says something else, since there was a nation. We'll look at that in a minute. Now, you might sit there and think, well, maybe we've already had the time of trouble such as never was. Perhaps it's already happened. Perhaps the Bible was already telling us about something that happened years ago. But it isn't. Because if you have a look in verse, now let's have a look. There should be a phrase somewhere, see if somebody can see it, where it says, to the time of the, yeah, that's it. Look in verse 4. You see there's a phrase halfway through verse 4. It says, at the time of the end. You see, all of this in Daniel chapter 12 is all about the time of the end. And in fact, if you go back into Daniel chapter 11, it also says, at the time of the end. Can anybody tell me which verse? Now this is a long chapter, right? So it's in the second half. Look at that. Instantaneously fantastic. So, Daniel 11 verse 40, have a look at that. We've got at the time of the end. And then in Daniel chapter 12 verse 4, we've got at the time of the end. And sort of in the middle of all this at the time of the end, we've got this time of trouble such as never was. It all happens at the time of the end. If you think we're in the time of trouble such as never was, you're wrong. It's so bad, this time of trouble that's coming is going to pale into insignificance as to what we see right now on the screens. But you can feel like it's building up to something, can't you? Things are sort of getting out of control with Russia and ISIS, and it's, you know, there's lots of trouble everywhere. So, here we go, look. That's what we looked at. There should be a time of trouble such as never was. Now look what it says there. Since there was a nation. Can anybody tell me when nations came into existence? What was the thing that was going on that produced nations?
Tower of Babel.
Tower of Babel. Good answer. I would say that. Because, does everybody remember the Tower of Babel? Because at the Tower of Babel, what did God do? He did something pretty dramatic.
Confuse the language.
He confused the languages, so suddenly there was lots and lots of languages. Before then, there wasn't French or German. When it, you know, at school back then, it was dead easy. There was only one language. You didn't have to do Latin. You didn't have to do any Russian. There was just one language, and God confused the language. And that's when people split up into different nations. So the next question is, did the Tower of Babel happen before or after the flood? after the flood. It did happen after the flood. So the Tower of Babel is in Genesis chapter 11, and the flood comes before that in the Bible, Genesis chapter 6, 7, and so on. So I know you can't really read this, but here we've got the flood in Noah's day was 2,370 years before Jesus was born. And then we've got the Tower of Babel being here 2,269. So it came a few hundred years. The Tower of Babel was a few hundred years after Noah's day. But what Daniel is saying, right, is that the time of trouble, have a look at it, it says there, the time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation. So that says to me, that sort of excludes the flood, because that came before there was a nation. Are you with me? So when he says there's a time of trouble such as never was, it's something that was trouble that such as never was, but since the Tower of Babel. But it didn't include the flood. Does that sort of, do you see where I'm going on that? But the flood was a big, big time of trouble, wasn't it? That was a big, big time of trouble. But you know something? Jesus quotes from Daniel chapter 12, verse 1 in Matthew 24. Now look at what Jesus says. Now he's talking about exactly the same situation. He says there'll be great tribulation. It's just another word for trouble. He says there's going to be great trouble, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. In fact, says Jesus, unless that time of calamity is shortened, not a single person would survive. In an old version, like the Authorized Version, it says no flesh would be saved. Nothing would be, anything made of flesh, animal, bird, fish, human, the whole lot would die. That's how bad Jesus says the time of trouble is going to be. So you see, Jesus goes right back to the beginning and says this time of trouble that's coming on the earth is that bad, you can go right back before the flood. Because look what he says. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world, and no, nor ever shall be. You see, you can't have two times of trouble, such as never was, no, nor ever shall be, can you? It's not possible to have two times of trouble, such as never was, no, nor ever shall be. You can only have one. Yes?
How could it be worse than the flood?
That's a very good question. How could it possibly be worse than the flood? Now, what Jesus says is, if the calamity wasn't shortened, everything would perish. In Noah's day, how many people survived? 8. Jesus says if God didn't intervene and shorten the days, which we'll see, not one person would survive. There wouldn't be an ark that would save anybody. The whole lot would have gone. That's how bad it's going to be. Let's look at some verses. This is the chapter that Richard read for us in Isaiah 24. Now, Isaiah 24 hasn't just been plucked out of context. If you actually looked at the chapters leading up to Isaiah 24, it's building up to a great big crescendo that hits Isaiah 24 and culminates in the horror story that Richard read for us. And this particular version puts it like this. Look, the Lord is about to lay waste the earth and make it desolate. He devastates the surface of the earth. So the surface of the earth, what does that sound like to you? Earthquakes. And it scatters the people, priests and lay people, servants and masters, maids and mistresses, buyers and sellers, lenders and borrowers, bankers and debtors. None will be spared. So it doesn't matter, says God, if you're a rich chap. It doesn't matter if you're a multi-millionaire with your private jet. Nothing will stop you being affected by this thing that's coming. Is that what it says, do you think? Pretty much covers every scenario, doesn't it, that? Let's have a look at another verse. Richard read this one as well. Therefore has a curse devoured the earth, and they that dwell therein are desolate. Therefore the inhabitants of the earth are burned, and look, few men are left. Now somebody tell me how many people are on planet Earth right now. You don't have to give me the exact number because it's changing every second, but what do you reckon? 7 point how many? I'll take that. 7.1 billion. 7.1 billion. Now I don't know what it means when it says few men are left, but it sounds a lot less than 7.1 billion, doesn't it? Something's coming on this earth where it's going to reduce the population of planet Earth right down to tiny numbers from where we are now. I told you all this was pretty scary, didn't I? It's all in the Bible, but 2 Peter chapter 3 verse 10 says that the day of the Lord is going to come as a thief in the night. It's going to come and take people unawares. You know, you don't know when the thief's turning up, do you? That's the point of a thief. He comes completely unexpectedly. In the which, now look at this, the heavens shall pass away with great noise, the elements shall melt with fervent heat. So when he talks about elements, this is like the atoms. You know, we're made of elements, aren't we? We're made of atoms that make us up, and even those elements, it says, even the atoms are going to melt with fervent heat. And the earth also, and the works that are therein are going to get burned up. So even the atoms themselves are going to start melting down. What else have we got? Ezekiel 38 verse 20. All men that are upon the face of the earth shall shake at my presence, and the mountains shall be thrown down, and the steep places shall fall, and every wall will fall to the ground. That sounds like a big earthquake, does it to you? Sounds like a very big earthquake, because every wall, you know, is going to fall to the ground. Matthew 24 verse 29, this is Jesus talking again, just after he talked about the time of trouble. He then says the sun will be darkened, the moon won't give her light, the stars are going to fall from heaven. How's that going to happen? I'll show you. The powers of the heavens shall be shaken. Now look, some of this is most definitely symbolic, but actually there's no doubt at all that there are physical things. With God there's always the physical and the symbolic, always. So this isn't just talking about political things, you know, something to do with symbology. This is also real. This is actually going to happen. The sun will go dark, the moon will stop shining, the stars will fall from heaven. How does that happen? As I say, I'll show you a video in a minute of how it will happen. Isaiah 13 verses 12 to 13, it's all in the same context of the final time of trouble. Now look at this. I will make a man more rare than fine gold. Now, is gold pretty rare? You don't see gold lying around the place. Oh, there's a chunk of gold. Oh, there's another bit. I'll have that. And God says, I'm going to make man as rare as gold. So you hardly see them. You'll hardly see a man. That's how much destruction is coming. Even a man than the golden wedge of Ophir. Therefore, says God, I will shake the heavens, and the earth shall remove out of her place in the wrath of the Lord of hosts, and in the day of his fierce anger. This is some serious shaking. You know, the earth doesn't really move, does it? It is pretty stable. This says the whole lot's going to go like that. That's pretty scary. Isaiah 24 again, the earth is utterly broken down, the earth is clean dissolved, the earth is moved exceedingly, the earth reels to and fro like a drunkard, and shall be removed like a cottage. Have you seen drunk people? They're all over. The world at the minute is beautiful, isn't it? It just doesn't move off its axis. We know to the second when that solar eclipse, lunar eclipse and solar eclipse were going to happen. Going beautifully. It isn't doing that, is it? God says that's what it's going to do. Revelation 16 verse 18, there were voices and thunders and lightnings. There was a great earthquake such as was not since men were upon the earth, so mighty an earthquake and so great. This is an earthquake that is off the scale. Never has there been an earthquake like the one that's coming. Revelation 16 verse 20, every island disappeared and all the mountains were levelled. There was a terrible hailstorm, and Hailstones weighing as much as 75 pounds fell from the sky onto the people below. This isn't just symbology, this bit of Revelation, this is real. A lot of Revelation is symbolic, not this bit, this is real. There will be hailstones falling, weighing 75 pounds. Now I don't know, what's somebody tell me, what would weigh 75 pounds?
A sack and a half potatoes.
Sack and a half potatoes, is that right? Sack and a half potatoes, wow. You don't want that falling on your head, because that's fallen some distance as well, hasn't it? Could have said sack and a half potatoes, but it wouldn't have sounded quite as good as 75 pounds. But that is what's falling from the sky. Look at this one, Revelation 6 verse 12 to 14, there was a great earthquake, the sun became as dark as a black cloth, the moon became as red as blood, the stars of the sky fell to the earth like green figs falling from a tree, shaken by a strong wind. The sky was rolled up like a scroll, and all of the mountains and islands were moved from their places. Mountains don't move, islands don't move, the earth doesn't move, it's all going to move. Revelation 16 verse 15, then everyone, the kings of the earth, the rulers, the generals, the wealthy, the powerful, and every slave and free person, all hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. Well, you would, wouldn't you? Because if your house has fallen down, that's where you're going to go. I'm going to find a hole to crawl into. So, pretty alarming picture, yeah? We don't feel that this is going to happen, do we? We sat there thinking, well, you know, the world carries on quite beautifully. I don't think all this is going to happen. Do you know something? The people that were banging on the ark door to get into the ark, and there were around about 700,000 people trying to get into the ark, right, banging on the door to get in, couldn't get in. But do you know what they said before? They said to Noah, you're off your head, mate. There's no flood coming. It doesn't even rain. We've never seen a raindrop. And you're about 400 miles away from the nearest sea, so I don't know what planet you're on, fella, but we're not getting on board that boat, because it's a joke. You've been on the project for 120 years, and you think there's this cataclysmic flood coming? No. Did it come? Yes. There's the evidence of the flood all around the planet. There's fossils of sea creatures on the top of Mount Everest. How did they get up there? Did they walk? How did a sea creature get to the... Of course it happened. Absolutely categorically happened. This is going to happen. The world will not continue forever. So what I'm going to do now is show you a video, because I'm conscious of time, right? So I'm going to show you this video. It only lasts a few minutes. Now what this video does, more than anything, is tries to show you pictorially what I've been talking about. But it actually says that the cause of what's going to happen is something called a polar shift. These are Christian people, they're not Christadelphians. They attribute much of what we're going to look at to something called a polar shift, where the poles change, but actually the whole Earth pretty much does that. Now, I'm not saying to you here and now that that is exactly what's going to happen, because the reality is nobody really knows. What I am showing you this video for is because it does picturise exactly what we've looked at. So take the polar shift bit out, if you like, and just look at what's going to happen. It might be a polar shift that causes some of these things, and I'll show you why it might be at the end of this video. So let's play some of this video here.
Good day. Not many people know what the Bible states about the second coming of Jesus Christ, and therefore, they are in danger of being deceived. This broadcast will provide you with the knowledge you need, so as not to be fooled by false Christs and false prophets. On the day which Jesus returns, there will be a polar reversal. Isaiah 24:20 says, "The earth will crack and shatter and split open. The earth itself will stagger like a drunk, sway like a hut in a storm. The world is weighed down by its sins. It will collapse and never rise again." Revelation 6:12 says, "There was a violent earthquake, and the sun became black like coarse black cloth, and the moon turned completely red like blood. The stars fell down to the earth, like unripe figs falling from the tree when a strong wind shakes it. The sky disappeared like a scroll, being rolled up, and every mountain and island was moved from its place. The polar flip will make the stars race across the sky, and the vacuum created from the reeling of the earth will pull the atmosphere along the ground, trying to catch up, creating what is known as a roll cloud, which will pull with it the dust and ash created from the global earthquake. Psalm 97:5 says, "The mountains melted like wax at the presence of the Lord." The global earthquake will be so bad that every hill and mountain will crumble. Revelation 16:20 says, "And every island fled away, and the mountains were not found." Revelation 6:15 says, "The kings of the earth, the princes, the commanding officers, the rich, the strong, and every slave and free person, hid themselves in the caves and in the rocks of the mountains. They told the mountains and the rocks, 'Fall on us, and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of his wrath has come. And who is able to stand?' The global earthquake will seem unending, and no one will be able to stand on that day, as the sky vanishes under a roll cloud and the stars fall from heaven. The buildings in every city in the world will collapse into utter destruction, killing millions." Isaiah 30:25 calls it the day of the great slaughter, when the towers fall. And just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, Revelation 16:21 says, "Hailstones, weighing about 100 pounds each, fell from the sky on people." After the volcanic ash and dust from the global earthquake has been kicked up into the sky, it will combine with a supercooled atmosphere from the vacuum created by the Earth's reeling. This will result in hailstones, which weigh about 100 pounds each. Matthew 20.
Quite interesting, isn't it, when you see it put like that? And I'm pretty certain it is going to look like something like that. The polar reversal bit that they talk about is quite interesting. There's a chap called Charles Hapgood that wrote about the polar reversal. This isn't just like the North Pole goes like that, it's like the whole Earth switches round. And basically, he wrote, do you know who this guy is? Albert Einstein. Now, Albert Einstein, when he was alive, clever chap, and he got every crackpot under the sun saying, "I've come up with a great idea," because if Einstein endorsed it, then basically, you were elevated up. And Charles Hapgood wrote to Albert Einstein and said, "I believe that we've got evidence that polar flips have happened before, and I think another one is going to happen," and basically went through some of the effects that we've been looking at. And Einstein actually wrote a foreword to the book where he says, "I frequently receive communications from people who wish to consult me concerning their unpublished ideas. It goes without saying that these ideas are very seldom possessed of any scientific validity. The very first communication, however, that I had received from Mr. Hapgood electrified me. His idea is original, of great simplicity, and if it continues to prove itself, of great importance to everything that's related to the history of the Earth's surface." And on he goes. So Einstein said, and he goes on and says, you can't actually fundamentally prove all the effects because nobody's seen it, but he actually believed in it enough to write a foreword to that book. Look, it doesn't bother me necessarily if it's a polar flip. I do think that that imagery that we saw is exactly what the Bible says is going to happen. Somehow or other, that is going to occur, polar flip or not. Question is, if that is as bad as it is, and that to me looks, if it carried on like that, worse than the flood, the point is, why is God bringing this about? Is that a good question? That's a good question. And you know something? You read the answer. Because you have a look in Isaiah 24, this crucial chapter that talks about all of this. It tells you why God's going to do it. And basically, it's in verse 5. "And these are the indictments of God on mankind." Not individual people, but on mankind as a whole. And there are three indictments. It says in verse 5 that the earth is defiled under the inhabitants thereof. So the earth is being defiled by human beings. Why? Well, because of three things. What's the first thing? They've transgressed the laws. What's the second thing? They've changed the ordinance. What's the third thing? They've broken the everlasting. Now, if you were walking down the road and you said to your friends at school or whatever, God's going to judge the world in a pretty terrible way, right? And they said, oh, really? Oh, yeah, he's going to judge the world. And they said to you, well, why is he going to do that then? And you said, well, because mankind has transgressed the laws, they've changed the ordinance, and they've broken the everlasting covenant. That's why. Would they know what you're talking about? No. So here's what we're going to do for around about 10 minutes. We're going to crack this, and we're going to crack this so well that you would be able to say to your friend at school who knows nothing about the Bible or anything else what those three things really mean. Because to me, if these are the three indictments of planet Earth, they're worth us knowing, aren't they? What does it mean to break the broken the everlasting covenant? What does it mean to change the ordinance? What is God talking about? That's what we're going to do. Or that's what you're going to do. Let's have a go here. So what you're going to do in your little group is just work on one of them. How good's that? So we're not making it too complicated. So, can I just say one thing before you crack on with this? And you've only got literally about 6 or 7 minutes, so don't have a massive, massive, massive thing over this. I'll tell you what I want, ultimately. Yeah, I've given you a little bit of home stuff to look at, but here's what I really, really want. I want each group to give me at the very end of it all a phrase that I could say to a 15-year-old on the street that they would understand what God's talking about. Got it? That's what we need. You're fine. Right, I think we're all there. Okay. Now, obviously, there's lots of groups, there's lots going on, so I might not be able to get every single solitary group of you feeding this back. So, I'll tell you where we're going to start. Put your hands in the air if you did this one. Okay, right, so let's start with the lads, okay? So, guys, what sort of things have you found out? Do you want to give us your phrase, actually? People have ignored God's rules and instructions that He's given them. That is I think that's great. People have ignored God's rules and instructions that He's given them. We'll come back and look in a little bit more detail, but any other groups got anything other... Well, no, you can tell me actually, what was your...
Yeah, but very similar. People live their lives with no regard for what God has asked of us.
Brilliant. No regard for what God has asked of us, yeah?
Again, pretty similar. People have chosen to either ignore God's rules or to manipulate them to suit their own interpretation and needs.
Now that's interesting, okay, because the manipulation, as you'll see in a minute, comes into the changing of the ordinances, okay? But this first one is primarily around, I just don't care about God's rules. I'm not even interested in them. I'm not trying to alter them, I'm ignoring them, point blank, nothing to do with them. Is that something, do you think, that's happening in the world, guys? Do you think people do ignore God's rules? Yeah. I think that does happen. I did put in here, I don't know whether you had a chance to think about this, in the Ten Commandments, which rules, if we just took the Ten Commandments as the base level, which ones of those is mankind ignoring right now? Oh, here we go. Here's the Ten Commandments. I am the Lord your God, you should worship only me. No, that's not happening. You shall not take the name of the Lord God in vain. Right? Remember to keep a day separate and where you remember God. No, let's go shopping. Honour your father and mother. Well, no, forget that. I'll swear at them instead and then I'll take them to court if they say anything. You shall not kill, but makes it through. You shall not commit adultery. No. If you're not happy with your husband or wife, well, happiness is the most important thing, so go off and have a great time. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not covet your neighbour's wife. Coveting is what the world's built on now, isn't it? Every advert on the TV is saying to you what you've actually got isn't quite good enough. Even your washing powder could be a little bit better. Right. So there we go. Right. So who had this one? Put your hand in the air if you had this one. Right. Okay. Let's start off over here again. So what's your this is a confusing one. Change the ordinance. They're not, the word ordinance isn't one that we normally use. So guys, what did you get for this? Give us the phrase.
We said people have changed God's rules, or people have created their own rules.
Brilliant. That's exactly right. So the word, tell me what the word ordinance is then. When we read the word ordinance, what's that?
Rule.
And you looked at one verse that was talking about a particular ordinance. What was that?
The sun, moon and stars, the seasons.
Got it. So the earth on its track, going like this beautifully, never ever altering, is in the Bible an ordinance. It never ever changes. It just does that all the time. So we know to the millisecond when something's going to happen. That is an ordinance. But this is saying mankind, and so that's a rule that God set up. He says the rule is the earth will do that. What this is saying is that mankind is changing God's rules. Anything to add from the other groups, guys?
A slight difference in as much that you asked what was the person changing. We read that he changed his mind, that he was worshipping his own power, trusting in his own power rather than God's.
Changing his mind. I've got a better idea. This is a better, I know God says this, but I've got a better idea than the one God's had. I'm going to make a new rule. Did anybody get any examples of where mankind hasn't just ignored God's rules, but said, I know, let's have a new rule?
Man and woman married.
Well, you couldn't get a bigger one than that, could you? God says, I made man and woman to be husband and wife. God did not make Adam and Steve. He didn't. He didn't. Man has said, I know, well, it might say that in the Bible, but come on, guys, we're in the 21st century. We can bend the rules. If a man loves a man, well, that's great. And what was illegal not that long ago is now taught, and promoted to the young people in school. Non-stop. That's changing the rules. These are just some headlines to do with evolution, from a religion point of view. I mean, this has gone on from time without end, hasn't it? Where people have said, actually, I know God says that women shouldn't be running the church and preaching from the front. Well, no, let's forget that now. It's obviously old hat, and God, let's move on. It's time we moved on. All these are headlines. All of it is changing the rules. Last one, broken the everlasting covenant. Okay, so who had this one? What's this? This is probably the trickiest of the lot, really, so we're glad that this intelligent group at the back's got that. Anybody else got this one? You guys got the right, let's start with you. So, what did we get to on this one, do you think?
We got that it's breaking apart or splitting the eternal agreement.
So it's to do with breaking apart and splitting the eternal agreement. And what was the deal? What was the agreement that God made to, and who did he make it to originally?
He made it to Abraham that he'd have his descendants, everyone would have the land of Israel, but then it was broken because now people are trying to split it in half and saying that the Jews are God.
This is a great answer. So basically, God said, I'm making an everlasting covenant with you, Abraham. And part of the everlasting covenant is I'm going to give you the land of Israel. Well, it says Canaan, but we know it became Israel forever. And so if, for instance, as you were rightly saying, mankind said, well, I know you said that, God, you're fine, but I'm ignoring it entirely. And actually the land of Israel we're going to break in two, which is exactly what's happening, is it not? I think the everlasting covenant is something to do with Israel in particular, because when you read about everlasting covenants, they are, especially where they're first mentioned, it's all to do with the land, it's all to do with Abraham, it's all to do with the nation that God is building. And are we seeing wholesale rejection of Israel and the Jews across the world? We are. Check this out. So I've put you know, to me, breaking the everlasting covenant is the world turning against Israel and dividing God's land. I think that is breaking the everlasting covenant. And look at these headlines. Anti-Semitism on the march. Europe braces for violence. British anti-Semitism set to hit a record high. These are recent headlines. MPs in the UK vote overwhelmingly in favour of recognising a Palestinian state. Is this breaking the everlasting covenant? November last year. Sweden recognises a Palestinian state. October last year. Palestine recognised as a state in principle by the European Parliament in symbolic vote, November last year. Palestinian statehood, French National Assembly votes overwhelmingly to ask the government to recognise Palestine, December last year. Israel slams Irish decision to recognise Palestine, that was on December last year. Israeli PM slams Europe taking Hamas off the terror list. That was December last year. So it's all happening. And those are the three reasons why God is going to bring this about. There is hope, you know, in amongst all of this. Because I know all this might have seemed pretty depressing. So I've got to wrap this up in 2 minutes, okay, to show you that there is hope. Because if it all ended up with a great big calamity and a whole load of disaster and God's going to judge the world and that's where it finished, well, if I sat down now, I know you want me to, Rich, but I've got to just wrap this up. So, do you realise that in every single passage that we looked at to do with the problem that's coming on the world, there is the hope next door to every single solitary verse? Watch this. So if you remember, we started off, Daniel 12, verse 1. There'll be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, yeah? Then it continues, and at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that's found written in the book, and many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life. Does that sound like a positive thing? Well, it is if you're with these people. If you're part of God's people, you're going to be rescued out of the time of trouble. So that sounds really positive, and obviously even if you've died beforehand, you're going to be raised from the dead. What about Matthew 24? Jesus said, look, there's going to be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no nor ever shall be. In fact, unless that time of calamity is shortened, not a single person will survive. Next bit, this follows straight on, but it will be shortened for the sake of God's chosen ones. God's going to cut down the time of trouble, because otherwise the whole planet would be destroyed. That's how bad it would get. The sun will be darkened, the moon won't give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, the powers of heaven shall be shaken. Next verse says, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And now look at this. This is the hope for us. He's going to send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet and gather together his chosen ones from the four winds. So we will see some of the time of trouble, but only some of it. And just as we're in it, God literally will send his angels, just like he did a long, long time ago. There was another great big cataclysmic destruction a long time ago, and God sent 2 angels and rescued some people. What am I talking about? Sodom and Gomorrah. 2 angels went and rescued Lot out. That's exactly what's going to happen. We will be rescued out of the time of trouble if we're still alive when Jesus gets back. Look at this. The earth is utterly broken down. The earth is clean dissolved. The earth is moved exceedingly. It's going to be rocked to and fro. Then it says, and the Lord of heaven's armies, or the Lord of hosts as it says in the AV, will rule on Mount Zion. He will rule in great glory in Jerusalem. So that terrifying chapter actually concludes with God, i.e. the Lord Jesus Christ, ruling on behalf of God, ruling in Jerusalem, and ruling in great glory. So Jesus comes back at the point when everything looks like it's over. The day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in the which the heavens shall pass away with a great noise, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat, and the earth will be burnt up, and so on and so on. Anybody know what the next bit says? Well, it says this. Since everything around us is going to be destroyed like this, what holy and godly lives should you be living? Looking forward to the day of God. You know, what are you playing at? What do you do? You know what the score is. You know exactly what's going to happen. What are you going to do about it? How are you going to live now? It's a good question, don't you think? So, final slide. What should we be doing? You see, the bottom line is, those three indictments, we could reverse them, couldn't we? So instead of God saying, you're in bad trouble because you haven't done this, if we turned it on its head, we can now say exactly what we should be doing. Does that make sense? So what we should be doing is following God's laws and instructions. Because the indictment of the world is that you're not. We should be keeping the rules for life that God has set out, not making up our own rules. And finally, we should accept that salvation is of the Jews, which is exactly what the Lord Jesus Christ said. Those are the three things that we should be doing. There is a time of trouble coming. I don't know when it's going to start. None of us do. But I'm telling you this now, that Isaiah chapter 24 comes at the end of 10 chapters. And in those 10 chapters, there are 10 national nightmares. 10 things that the world can't do anything about. The Bible calls them burdens. And there's the burden of Iraq, and there's the burden of Syria, and there's the burden of Egypt, and there is the burden of Iran, and there is the burden of Israel, and there is the burden of Saudi Arabia, South Saudi Arabia, which we're just seeing happening now in the news. And all of these are national nightmares that the world can do nothing about, and they all culminate in chapter 24. I don't think we've got a long time to go until we see the time of trouble such as never was. And therefore, we need to make sure we're on God's side and not in the horror that is actually coming. But all of it will culminate in Jesus returning, the horror being cut short, and the wonderful, wonderful kingdom being set up. And all of this mess that the world has got into will get sorted out.